The Spanish conquest of England sends shockwaves across the entire globe, affecting regions far beyond Europe in ways both immediate and gradual. The balance of maritime power shifts dramatically when Spanish authority extends over English ports and shipyards. The great age of English seafaring that would have produced explorers and colonizers in our timeline is either redirected into Spanish service or curtailed entirely. The oceans become more firmly a Spanish domain, at least for a generation. In North America, the colonial landscape transforms completely. Without independent English colonization, the eastern seaboard develops very differently. Spanish colonial efforts, now augmented by English resources and manpower, push further north than in our timeline. Settlements appear in regions that our history knows as Virginia, Maryland, and perhaps even further up the coast. These colonies follow Spanish colonial models: strict Catholic organization, encomienda labor systems, extraction of resources for the imperial center. The indigenous peoples encounter European colonization in a different form and from different directions. French colonial efforts in North America receive less competition from English interests, allowing New France to expand more expensively. French fur traders, missionaries, and settlers push further into the interior, establishing a stronger French presence throughout the Great Lakes region and down the Mississippi River Valley. The competition that shapes North American development in our history becomes primarily French-Spanish rivalry rather than French-English-Spanish competition. This changes the diplomatic relationships with indigenous nations, who negotiate with a different set of European powers. In the Caribbean, the absence of English privateering and later English colonization means islands that in our world became English possessions remain Spanish or fall to other powers. Jamaica, Barbados, and the smaller Antilles develop differently. The sugar plantation economy that would devastate these islands still emerges, but under Spanish or French control. The demographic mixing, the enslaved African populations, the cultural formations all follow somewhat different patterns when English influence is removed from the equation. In East Asia, Asia experiences the consequences more indirectly, but no less significantly. The English East India Company in our timeline became a dominant force in Indian Ocean trade and eventually contributed to British colonization of India. In this alternate world, either the English East India Company never forms in the same way, operates under Spanish license, or remains much smaller than its historical counterpart. Portuguese and Dutch interests remain more dominant in Asian trade. The eventual colonization of India, which in our history was primarily British, either comes much later, takes a different form under different colonial powers, or possibly never occurs in the same way. Africa's Atlantic coast faces altered European contact. The slave trade, that horrific institution that devastated African societies, continues to expand as Spanish colonies require labor, but the specific networks of slaving differ. English slave traders, who in our history became major participants in this evil commerce, are either absent or operate under Spanish license. The particular kingdoms and regions that in our history dealt primarily with English slavers instead face different European buyers. The overall scale of suffering may not change dramatically, but the specific historical trajectories of particular African peoples shift. In East Asia, Japan's decision to close itself to Western contact, which occurred in the 1630s in our timeline, might be reinforced by seeing Spanish power grow so dramatically. Chinese authorities, always cautious about European merchants and missionaries, have their suspicions confirmed when Spanish dominance increases. The Qing dynasty, which will soon consolidate control over China, watches European developments with calculating interest.
The balance of power in East Asian waters becomes more clearly Spanish and Portuguese, with Dutch present, but without significant English competition. The Islamic world observes these Christian European power struggles with mixed feelings. The Ottoman Empire, long the greatest rival to Habsburg power, sees Spanish strength increase with England's fall. Yet Spain's preoccupation with European affairs and colonial management means less direct military pressure on Ottoman frontiers. Safavid Persia, caught between Ottomans and Mughals, finds the distant European power dynamics of little immediate concern, but notes that Christian European expansion seems unstoppable. The psychological impact of European ascendancy in this era, already significant in our history, becomes even more pronounced. These ripples continue outward, touching every continent and major civilization. The world of the late 16th century means that a fundamental change in European power relations affects trading patterns, missionary activities, military balances, and cultural contacts everywhere. The world that emerges by the mid-17th century looks dramatically different from our timeline, though many daily realities for most people remain similar. History's great forces have been redirected down a different channel, flowing toward an unknown ocean.
By the year 1700, more than a century after the Spanish Armada's successful invasion, the world that has emerged bears both familiar and alien aspects. England remains under Catholic rule, though the nature of that rule has evolved. The initial military occupation has long since transitioned to a more subtle form of control. The Spanish troops eventually withdrew, leaving behind a thoroughly Catholic English establishment that maintains its alignment with Madrid through dynastic ties, shared religion, economic integration, and cultural affinity. An English Catholic identity has taken root among the upper and middle classes, though pockets of Protestant memory persist in remote regions. The English language has evolved into something noticeably different from the English of our timeline. Spanish loanwords permeate the vocabulary, especially in government, religion, and commerce. The literature produced in this Anglo-Iberian culture blends traditions in unique ways. English poets write in both languages, sometimes mixing them in the same work. The great English literary flowering that in our world produced Shakespeare in the late Elizabethan era has in this world taken a different form. There are still great dramatists and poets, but their themes, their concerns, and their style reflect a Catholic sensibility and Spanish influence. The works they produce are beautiful and profound, but they are not the same works that our timeline knows. Scotland has developed as a major Protestant power, its identity forged in resistance to the Spanish Catholic colossus to its south. Edinburgh rivals Amsterdam as a center of Protestant culture and learning. Scottish engineers, scholars, and merchants operate throughout Northern Europe and in overseas colonies. The Scottish diaspora has spread across the Protestant world, creating networks of trade and knowledge that compete with Spanish Catholic commercial systems. Scotland has proven that a relatively small nation with determination and favorable circumstances can maintain independence even against great power pressure. Continental Europe remains divided, but in a different configuration than our history. The great conflict that, in our world, was the 30 Years' War occurred in this timeline as well, but its causes, course, and conclusion differed because of the altered balance of power. Spain, strengthened by English resources and facing less naval harassment, prosecuted the Catholic cause more effectively. Yet even Spanish power had limits, and the exhaustion from prolonged warfare eventually forced compromises. The Peace of Westphalia, in this world, whenever it finally came, established a different religious settlement and territorial arrangement than the one we know. France has emerged as the primary counterweight to Spanish power, regardless of shared Catholic faith. French national interest required resisting Spanish dominance, and over the decades France built alliances and pursued policies aimed at maintaining European balance. A Franco-Scottish alliance anchors the resistance to Spanish hegemony.
The Sun King, Louis XIV in our timeline, in this world pursues similar policies of grandeur and expansion, but in a different strategic context. French culture flourishes as it does in our history, but with somewhat different characteristics, shaped by rivalry with a more powerful Spain. The colonial empires in the Americas have developed differently. Spanish America extends further north and is more thoroughly consolidated. The diversity of colonial powers that characterized our timeline's North America, with English, French, Dutch, and Spanish all competing for territory, has in this world resolved more toward Spanish dominance in the eastern regions, with stronger French presence in the interior. The cultural and demographic consequences are profound. The places that in our world became the United States have in this timeline become something else entirely. Perhaps a Spanish viceroyalty, perhaps a patchwork of Spanish, French, and indigenous territories. The slave trade continues its horrific operations, feeding the plantation economies of the Americas and enriching European merchants and rulers. The specific routes and traders differ from our timeline, but the fundamental evil remains. Millions of enslaved Africans are torn from their homes and subjected to unspeakable cruelty. The moral stain on this alternate history is as dark as in our own. The cultures that emerge from this forced mixing of European, African, and indigenous peoples are distinctive to this timeline, but carry the same tragedy at their foundation. In Asia, European colonization has proceeded more slowly in some regions, differently in others. Without British dominance in India, that subcontinent's history follows another path. Perhaps the Mughal Empire maintains its power longer. Perhaps different European powers vie for influence. Perhaps regional kingdoms preserve more independence into later centuries. The consequences for hundreds of millions of people are impossible to calculate, but undoubtedly profound. In East Asia, China and Japan continue to manage their relationships with European powers on their own terms, and the eventual European impact, when it comes from different directions and with different dynamics. This world in 1700 is entering its own age of enlightenment, but the intellectual currents flow through different channels. The scientific revolution has occurred, but with different leading figures and in different locations. The philosophical debates about reason, faith, and the nature of society engage Catholic, Protestant, and secular thinkers in a conversation that parallels but differs from our timeline's enlightenment. Some ideas that were central in our history never emerge, or emerge only weakly. Other ideas that were marginal in our world gain greater prominence. The texture of thought is distinct.
When we pause to compare this alternate timeline with the world we actually inhabit, the differences cascade in every direction. In our real history, England's defeat of the Spanish Armada marked a turning point toward English ascendancy. Over the following centuries, Britain became a global empire, spreading English language and culture across vast territories, driving the early Industrial Revolution and shaping the modern world in countless ways. That entire historical trajectory has been erased in this alternate path. In our world, the United States emerged from English colonies and inherited English legal traditions, the English language, and English cultural foundations, which it then built upon and transformed. American democracy, with all its flaws and promise, grew from seeds planted in English soil. In this alternate history, if anything resembling the United States exists at all in that geographic location, it is something utterly different, perhaps Spanish, perhaps French, perhaps a patchwork of colonial territories that never unified, perhaps something no one in our world could anticipate. The Industrial Revolution as we know it began in England in the 18th century, driven by particular combinations of capital, resources, technology, culture, and institutions. In this alternate world, whatever industrial transformation eventually occurs, the Dutch Republic, regions where Protestant culture and commercial capitalism have flourished.
Perhaps it comes later and more slowly, emerging in multiple places rather than radiating out from one center. The technological landscape of the 19th and 20th centuries in this timeline bears little resemblance to our own. The English language, which in our world became the global lingua franca through a combination of British Empire and American power, has in this timeline remained a regional language blended with Spanish influences and limited to the British Isles and whatever scattered communities preserved it abroad. Spanish has perhaps become even more dominant as a world language, or perhaps French or Dutch rose to greater prominence. The very medium through which much of humanity communicates in the modern era has changed. Democracy and liberalism, which in our history developed strongly in England and America before spreading globally, have in this timeline either emerged from different sources or taken different forms, or perhaps remain weaker as political philosophies. The rights and freedoms that many people in our world take for granted, however imperfectly realized, might in this alternate world be less widespread or differently conceived. Political development follows other patterns when the English and American models are absent or fundamentally altered. The two world wars that devastated the 20th century in our timeline would, if they occurred at all in this alternate history, have entirely different causes, alliances, and outcomes. Without British naval power and without the United States as it existed in our history, the military balance of the 20th century is unrecognizable. Perhaps conflicts on that scale never occurred. Perhaps they occurred earlier or later or in different forms. Perhaps entirely different struggles defined the century. The 50 million deaths from our world wars might never have happened, but different tragedies may have unfolded instead. The Cold War, decolonization, the Civil Rights Movement, the space race, the development of nuclear weapons, the rise of China, the Internet age. Every major development of our recent history either never happens, happens differently, or is replaced by events we cannot imagine. When a timeline diverges in 1588, by the time you reach the present day of the 21st century, the accumulated differences are so vast that the two worlds share almost nothing except the basic geography of continents and the fundamental biology of human nature. Yet, human nature itself is the constant. In both timelines, people love and fear, hope and despair, create and destroy. Parents care for children, artists seek beauty, philosophers pursue truth, tyrants grasp power. The specific forms and contexts differ, but the underlying human experiences transcend any particular timeline. This is perhaps the deepest insight that alternative history offers, not the specifics of what might have been, but the recognition that humanity persists through all possible variations.
As we reach the end of this journey through a world that never was, let your mind drift with the images and ideas we have explored together tonight. The Spanish Armada sailing toward English shores under favorable winds, Spanish soldiers establishing control over London, the gradual transformation of English culture over generations, the ripples spreading across oceans and centuries. All of it is speculation, an exercise in historical imagination, but perhaps valuable for that very reason. Alternate history teaches us something about the nature of causation and contingency. So much of what we take as inevitable in our own timeline was actually the result of particular circumstances and choices. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was not foreordained. English weather and English naval tactics and luck combined to produce one outcome, but other outcomes were possible. History is not a single track leading inevitably toward our present, but rather a vast tree of branching possibilities, and we happen to live in one particular branch. This recognition can be humbling. The world we know, with all its specific features and developments, is one possibility among many. Different choices at critical junctures could have led to vastly different worlds. This does not mean all choices are equal or that all outcomes are equally desirable. Some paths lead toward greater freedom and flourishing, others toward tyranny and suffering. But it does mean that the specific constellation of circumstances we inhabit was not the only possibility. For England, the successful defense against the Armada in our real history became a founding myth of national identity, a moment of triumph that resonated through centuries. In the alternate world we have imagined tonight, that triumph never occurred. English identity formed instead around resistance, accommodation, and the complex experience of conquest and cultural blending. Neither identity is more authentic than the other. Both arise from historical circumstances, from the raw material of human response to events. For the world more broadly, the implications extend far beyond England itself. Colonial patterns, linguistic spread, scientific developments, political philosophy, religious distributions, all of these were shaped by which powers ascended and which declined in the early modern period. The butterfly effect operates across centuries. A storm that did disperse the Armada in our world, but in imagination did not, changes the course of human civilization. Yet through all these changes, certain constants remain. Human beings in this alternate timeline experienced joy and sorrow, sought meaning in their lives, raised their children, created art and literature, struggled with questions of justice and power. The specific forms differed, but the underlying human experience persisted. This too is worth contemplating as you drift toward sleep. Whatever the timeline, whatever the circumstances, humanity endures and strives. Perhaps the greatest value of these thought experiments lies not in the specific details of alternate worlds, but in what they reveal about historical thinking itself. They force us to question assumptions, to recognize contingency, to see that the world might have been otherwise. This awareness can make us more thoughtful about the present and the future. If past outcomes were not inevitable, then future outcomes are also not predetermined. Our choices matter. The direction we take collectively as a species remains open. As you settle into rest now, wherever you are in the world, whatever time your clock shows, let these ideas percolate in the quiet spaces of your mind. The Spanish Armada that succeeded in imagination, the England that never became Britain, the world that took a different path, none of it real, all of it possible. And in the space between reality and possibility, we find room to think more deeply about history, causation, and the strange contingency of everything we know. Thank you for joining this exploration of what might have been. May your sleep be peaceful, your dreams full of wonder, and your waking thought enriched by the contemplation of paths not taken. Until next time, when we meet again to explore another branch of history's infinite tree, rest well in the certainty that however strange the alternatives we imagine, our own world is equally strange, equally contingent, and equally full of possibility. Good night.
Welcome to another scenario of alternative history. Thoughts you get before going to sleep. Before we begin our journey through a world that never was, take a moment to settle in wherever you are right now. Whether you are listening from a quiet room in London or New York, from Tokyo or somewhere under the southern stars, and whether it is late evening where you rest or the deep hours of night, let yourself sink into this story. Consider sharing in the comments below where in the world you are listening from and what time it is as you hear these words. Now let us drift together into a different current of time. Imagine the summer of 1588, but not as it unfolded in the history we know. The winds across the English Channel blow differently now. The great crescent formation of Spanish warships does not scatter in confusion and storm. Instead, picture the sails of the Spanish Armada catching favorable winds, their hulls cutting through calmer waters than fate granted them in our timeline. King Philip II of Spain has spent years planning this moment, assembling 130 ships, 30,000 men, and the determination to restore Catholic rule to England and end the piracy that has plagued Spanish treasure fleets. In our history, storms and English fire ships and the superior maneuverability of English vessels turned the Spanish fleet away. The Armada limped home around Scotland and Ireland, battered and broken, with thousands dead and Philip's ambitions shattered. But consider now a world where the weather favors Spain, where the timing aligns perfectly, where the Duke of Parma's waiting army in the Spanish Netherlands successfully coordinates with the fleet. The Spanish ships anchor off the coast of Kent and Sussex. Soldiers pour from transport vessels onto English soil. The invasion that Elizabeth I feared most has become reality. The English forces, though brave and determined, find themselves overwhelmed by the sheer numbers and the coordination of Spanish military might. The trained tercios, Spain's legendary infantry formations, establish beachheads and push inland. Queen Elizabeth rallies her forces at Tilbury, delivering speeches of defiance, but the military arithmetic favors the invaders. Within a week, Spanish and Allied forces have secured critical ports and begun their march toward London. The capital prepares for siege, and the fate of England hangs in unprecedented balance. This is the moment where our timeline splits, where history takes a turn into shadowed waters. The consequences will ripple forward through centuries, reshaping not just England, but the entire world. As we explore this alternate path together tonight, let your mind wander through the possibilities, through the generations that follow from this single change. Let us see what manner of world emerges when the Armada succeeds.
The first years following the Spanish invasion of England unfold with the harsh inevitability of conquest. By the autumn of 1588, London has fallen. Queen Elizabeth, rather than face capture, has fled northward with loyalist forces, establishing a government in exile somewhere in the Scottish borderlands. The great city that was the heart of Protestant England now finds itself under occupation. Spanish standards fly above the Tower of London, and Catholic Mass is celebrated once more in churches that had been stripped of their icons decades before. King Philip does not annex England outright into the Spanish crown. Such a move would be impractical and would inflame resistance beyond containment. Instead, he installs a puppet monarch, carefully chosen from among English Catholic nobility who had remained faithful to Rome through the years of persecution. Some historians in this timeline will later argue he considered claiming the throne through his own genealogical connections, but practical governance requires a more nuanced approach. The new Catholic monarch rules under the heavy influence of Spanish advisors and occupying forces. The religious transformation begins immediately, but proceeds with calculated patience. Protestant worship is not banned overnight, which would risk massive uprising, but it faces increasing restrictions. Catholic properties confiscated during the English Reformation are returned to the Church. Monasteries begin to reappear across the landscape. Protestant clergy face a choice between conversion, exile, or quiet retirement. Many choose exile, fleeing to Scotland, to the German Protestant states, to the Dutch Republic. This exodus drains England of some of its most educated and principled voices. Resistance movements emerge throughout the countryside. In Wales, in Cornwall, and the northern counties, bands of Protestant loyalists wage guerrilla warfare against Spanish forces and their English collaborators. These are brutal years of reprisal and counter-reprisal. Villages suspected of harboring rebels face harsh punishment. Yet the Spanish and their Catholic English allies prove ruthless in their determination to pacify the realm.
Military governors established control region by region, aided by the reality that many English people, exhausted by religious conflict and uncertain of the future, choose accommodation over resistance. The economic disruption is severe. Trade with Protestant nations largely ceases. The English wool trade, once the backbone of prosperity, must find new markets or wither. Spanish merchants move into London and Bristol, establishing new commercial networks that tie England more firmly into the Iberian economic sphere. The coinage is gradually altered, showing the faces of the new rulers. Spanish becomes the language of administration alongside English, and those who wish to rise in the new order begin learning it with grim determination. Queen Elizabeth's government in exile maintains symbolic resistance for several years, but without foreign support and with dwindling resources, its practical power fades. Some say she dies in Scotland around 1595. Others whisper she made it to France or even to the American colonies. The truth becomes lost to legend. What matters is that by the turn of the 17th century, Spanish-backed Catholic rule over England appears permanent and unchallengeable. The Protestant cause, which had seemed so triumphant just a generation before, has suffered a catastrophic defeat.
The political map of Europe transforms in response to England's fall. The balance of power that had been slowly tilting toward a multipolar system of competing nations now swings dramatically toward Spanish Habsburg dominance. With England neutered as a Protestant power and brought under Catholic control, Spain achieves a hegemonic position not seen since the height of Roman imperial power. The dream of a united Catholic Christendom under Spanish leadership seems, for a time, within reach. Scotland faces an impossible situation. Sharing an island with Spanish-occupied England, receiving floods of English Protestant refugees, and fearful of being the next target of Philip's ambitions, the Scottish crown must make careful calculations. In our timeline, Scotland and England would eventually unite under a single crown in 1603. In this altered world, Scotland instead draws closer to France and seeks protection through renewed alliance with continental Protestant powers. The border between Scotland and occupied England becomes one of the most militarized frontiers in Europe, bristling with fortifications and marked by constant skirmishing. The Dutch Republic, already fighting for independence from Spanish rule in the 80 Years' War, loses a crucial ally with England's fall. English financial support and privateering against Spanish shipping had been vital to Dutch resistance. Now isolated and facing the full weight of Spanish military attention, the Dutch struggled to maintain the rebellion. Some provinces that had declared independence are reincorporated into Spanish control. The United Provinces that do survive become a smaller, more vulnerable entity, though their determination to resist remains fierce. France watches these developments with deep concern. The French wars of religion, which plague France through this same period, take on a different character when Spain's power grows so dramatically. French Catholic factions find themselves strengthened by Spanish success, but French national interest requires resisting Spanish dominance, regardless of religious sympathy. The result is a complex dance of religious solidarity mixed with political rivalry. France cannot allow Spain to grow too powerful, yet French Catholics celebrate the return of England to the Church. The Holy Roman Empire, that patchwork of German states nominally united under an elected emperor, finds its internal divisions exacerbated. Protestant German princes, alarmed by Spanish Habsburg power and the fall of Protestant England, band together more tightly in defensive leagues. Catholic princes gravitate toward the Spanish sphere. The religious geography of Central Europe becomes even more fractured and tense.
The stage is being set for conflicts that will make the historical 30 Years' War seem almost modest by comparison. In Eastern Europe, Poland and the Ottoman Empire observe these Western struggles with calculating eyes. The Ottoman Sultan recognizes that Spanish preoccupation with consolidating control over England and managing European rivalries means less Spanish naval power in the Mediterranean. Ottoman fleets become bolder. Poland, caught between Protestant Sweden to the north and Orthodox Russia to the east, finds the Catholic-Protestant divide in Western Europe reflected and amplified in its own precarious position. Every shift in the European balance affects Polish security. The papacy in Rome rejoices at England's return to the faith, yet papal independence becomes compromised by overwhelming Spanish power. The Pope crowns the new Catholic King of England and celebrates the triumph of the Counter-Reformation, but he also recognizes that Spanish dominance of Catholic Europe limits papal freedom of action. The relationship between Madrid and Rome becomes that of protector and protected, and not always clear who truly holds ultimate authority in Catholic affairs.
Daily life in England under Spanish influence transforms gradually but profoundly over the next several generations. In the immediate aftermath of conquest, the changes are most visible in cities and among the upper classes. London streets hear Spanish spoken alongside English. Catholic churches conduct elaborate ceremonies that had been absent for decades. Religious processions return, winding through neighborhoods with crosses and banners and singing. For older English people who remember the reign of Mary Tudor, there is an eerie sense of time folding back on itself, of history repeating. The English language itself begins to absorb Spanish words and phrases, especially in matters of administration, religion, and commerce. A distinct dialect emerges among the English Catholic elite who collaborate most closely with Spanish authorities. To speak in this hybrid manner marks one as part of the new order. Conversely, maintaining purely English speech, especially with deliberate archaisms from the Protestant era, becomes a subtle form of resistance. Language becomes a marker of loyalty and identity in ways both obvious and hidden. Education undergoes systematic transformation. The grammar schools that had flourished under Protestant patronage are gradually reformed under Catholic supervision. Jesuit schools establish themselves in major towns, offering rigorous education but within a firmly Catholic framework. The universities at Oxford and Cambridge face purges of Protestant fellows and the installation of Catholic administrators. Classical learning continues, for it serves both Catholic and Protestant purposes, but the interpretation of texts and history shifts. Students learn to see England's Protestant decades as a tragic deviation from its true Catholic nature. The arts flourish in some directions, while withering in others. The vibrant English theater tradition that produced playwrights like Christopher Marlowe faces new censorship. Religious themes must conform to Catholic orthodoxy. Political content becomes dangerous. Some playwrights adapt, embedding their critique in allegory and historical setting. Others fall silent or flee to Scotland or the continent. Yet Spanish patronage brings new influences as well. Spanish musical traditions, Spanish literary forms, Spanish visual arts begin to intermingle with English culture. A hybrid Anglo-Iberian artistic culture emerges, strange and rich and unlike anything that existed before. Architecture changes the face of English cities. New Catholic churches rise in Spanish Baroque style with elaborate facades and rich interior decoration. The plain Protestant churches are gradually adorned with paintings, sculptures, and stations of the cross. Monasteries and convents reappear, solid stone establishments that mark the permanence of the new order.
In the countryside, great houses of Protestant gentry who refuse to convert are confiscated and given to Catholic families. The very landscape becomes a text to be read, telling the story of conquest and transformation. Family life reorganizes around Catholic rhythms. The saints' days and festivals that had been suppressed return to the calendar. Confession and Mass become central to weekly routine. Marriage customs shift back toward Catholic requirements, though many rural areas continue Protestant-influenced practices in private. The generation of English children born after 1588 grow up in a world their grandparents would hardly recognize, where Catholic practice is simply normal, where Spanish military presence is simply a fact of life, where the Protestant ascendancy of Elizabeth's reign becomes a story told in whispers. Yet, beneath official culture, resistance culture persists. Protestant psalms are sung behind closed doors. English history from before the conquest is preserved in handwritten manuscript copied in secret. Stories of Queen Elizabeth's defiance become legends told to children. In remote regions, Protestant ministers continue their work in hiding, traveling from house to house, conducting services in barns and forests. This underground culture, dangerous and defiant, keeps alive the memory of England's Protestant past, even as the surface of society becomes increasingly Catholic and Hispanicized.
The economic consequences of England's integration into the Spanish sphere ripple across the Atlantic world. England's merchants, who had been building trade networks in competition with Spanish and Portuguese interests, now find themselves either absorbed into Iberian commercial systems or shut out entirely. The English privateers and pirates who had preyed on Spanish treasure fleets, figures like Francis Drake, who in our timeline became heroes, are in this world either dead, exiled, or brought to heel. The flow of New World silver to Europe increasingly moves through Spanish-controlled English ports as well as through Seville and Lisbon. The wool trade, England's traditional source of wealth, must adapt to new realities. Flemish textile centers, some under Spanish control and some in the rebellious Dutch provinces, become both markets and competitors. English wool finds its way into Spanish textile industries as well. The merchant class that had grown wealthy under Protestant rule faces a choice similar to that of the clergy: adapt to Spanish oversight, maintain their wealth by converting to Catholicism and accepting the new order, or lose everything. Many choose pragmatic accommodation, though they preserve what independence they can. New trade routes develop between England and Spanish America. English ports begin to see ships arriving from Cartagena, Veracruz, and Havana, carrying sugar, tobacco, cochineal, and other New World goods. In return, English manufactures and wool flow westward. This commerce enriches some English merchants, but also makes England economically dependent on Spanish imperial systems. The integration is deliberate. Philip and his successors understand that economic interdependence helps prevent rebellion. If English prosperity depends on good relations with Madrid, England is less likely to rise against Spanish influence. The loss of England as a Protestant power and commercial rival dramatically affects colonial development. In our timeline, English colonization of North America proceeded rapidly in the early 17th century, leading to settlements at Jamestown, Plymouth, and beyond. In this altered world, English colonial efforts are either redirected into Spanish-sanctioned enterprises or severely curtailed. The eastern seaboard of North America develops differently, perhaps more thoroughly Spanish, perhaps with more extensive French presence, perhaps left longer to indigenous peoples. The entire trajectory of what would become the United States changes fundamentally. Banking and finance shift as well. English capital, which in our history would flow into joint stock companies and colonial ventures, in this timeline becomes more cautious, more conservative, more oriented towards Spanish-controlled opportunities. The financial innovations that would drive England's rise to commercial supremacy in our timeline either develop elsewhere or appear more slowly.
Amsterdam, despite the pressures on the Dutch Republic, becomes even more central to European finance as Protestant and Jewish bankers establish institutions beyond Spanish reach. Agricultural patterns in England adjust to Spanish preferences and needs. Certain crops gain emphasis while others fade. Spanish administrators introduce new techniques in some regions while traditional English farming continues in others. The efficiency of English agriculture, which in our timeline would contribute to early industrialization, develops differently under Spanish influence. Some innovations occur, but the incentive structures differ. The flow of ideas comes from different sources, and the pace of change alters. Spain itself, paradoxically, both benefits and suffers from its expanded power. The wealth flowing through Spanish-controlled England adds to the crown's resources, but the costs of occupation and administration are enormous. The Spanish economy, already dependent on New World silver and struggling with inflation, faces new strains. English resources help Spain maintain its hegemonic position longer than it did in our history, but they also enable Spain to avoid economic reforms that might have created more sustainable prosperity. The Spanish Empire in this timeline becomes larger and more extended, but also potentially more fragile in the long term.
The scientific revolution that transformed Europe during the 17th century follows a different course in this alternate timeline. In our world, England became a crucial center of scientific advancement, producing figures like Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, and William Harvey, and hosting institutions like the Royal Society. The question becomes, what happens to English scientific potential under Spanish Catholic influence? And how does the broader European scientific community develop when England's contribution changes or diminishes? The Catholic Church's relationship with scientific inquiry in this period was complex, not uniformly hostile as sometimes portrayed, but certainly cautious and bounded by theological concerns. The trial of Galileo in our timeline showed the limits of acceptable inquiry. In Spanish-influenced England, natural philosophy continues, but within constraints. Universities remain intellectually active, but certain questions become dangerous to pursue. The heliocentric model of the solar system, for instance, meets greater resistance in England than it would have in our timeline. English scholars who wish to pursue controversial research must either exercise great caution, publish anonymously or abroad, or emigrate to Protestant regions. Some scientific inquiry actually finds support under the new regime. Spanish interest in navigation, cartography, mining techniques, and metallurgy means that research in these areas receives patronage. English scholars who focus on practical applications useful to Spain's imperial interests find opportunities. Mathematical work, especially as it applies to engineering and fortification, continues to develop. Medical knowledge advances through exchange with Spanish universities and through continued translation of Arabic texts preserved in Spanish libraries. The scientific landscape becomes uneven, with some fields flourishing while others stagnate or migrate elsewhere. The printing industry in England faces strict censorship, but printing does not stop. What changes is the content. Religious works dominate output, along with texts approved by Spanish authorities. Scientific books printed in England must pass ecclesiastical review. This slows the dissemination of new ideas, but does not entirely prevent it. Books printed in Amsterdam, Geneva, or German Protestant cities circulate clandestinely in England. English scientists maintain correspondence with colleagues abroad, though they must be cautious. Knowledge continues to flow, but through narrower channels and more slowly than in our timeline. Scotland and the Dutch Republic become even more important centers of scientific activity in this altered world. Protestant scholars fleeing England bring their knowledge and energy to these regions. Scottish universities experience a golden age of learning, partly fueled by English refugee intellectuals. Amsterdam's already vibrant scholarly community gains additional luster.
The center of gravity for European science shifts northward, away from Spanish-controlled regions, toward Protestant areas where intellectual freedom is greater. This geographical redistribution of scientific activity has long-term consequences for where industrialization and technological innovation later emerge. Technological development follows similar patterns. English craftsmen and inventors continue their work, but transformative innovations that might threaten existing social orders or conflict with religious teaching face barriers. The relationship between technological change and social upheaval that characterizes the coming industrial revolution in our timeline becomes more complicated. Some technologies that would have emerged in England instead appear in France, in the German states, or in Northern Europe. Others simply develop more slowly when English contribution is limited. Medicine advances, but medical ethics becomes intertwined with Catholic doctrine more thoroughly than in Protestant regions. Anatomical study continues, building on Renaissance traditions, but must navigate religious sensitivities about the body and the soul. English physicians who train at Spanish or Italian universities absorb the best medical knowledge available, but they also work within theological frameworks that shape what questions can be asked and what procedures are acceptable. The result is medical practice that is sophisticated in some ways, but constrained in others. Natural history and the collection of knowledge about the world proceeds with Spanish imperial interests in mind. English scholars participate in cataloging the plants, animals, and peoples of the Spanish Empire, contributing to a vast project of understanding and controlling colonial territories. This work produces valuable knowledge but serves imperial purposes. The kind of scientific inquiry that in our timeline would be more independent and curiosity-driven becomes more instrumental and directed. The orientation of English science changes from what might have been to what serves Spanish needs.